Imagine boarding a routine morning flight, expecting nothing more than a short journey and a cup of coffee in the air. The airport is crowded, aircraft are lined up ahead, and after a long wait, your plane finally rolls onto the runway. The engines roar, the cabin vibrates, and you are pressed back into your seat as speed rapidly builds. Everything feels normal until it suddenly isn't. As the nose of the aircraft lifts, the rest of the plane refuses to follow. Loud thuds shake the cabin. Metal scrapes against concrete. Sparks fly beneath the tail. Inside the cockpit, confusion replaces confidence. In that moment, the flight is already doomed. This is the tragic story of Delta Airlines Flight 1141, an accident that should never have happened. On the morning of 31st August 1988, a Boeing 727 Saturday at Dallas, Fort Worth International Airport preparing for departure to Salt Lake City, Utah. The flight carried 101 passengers and 4 cabin crew members, many of them families returning from vacations, others traveling for work. The aircraft itself was 14 years old, reliable, and largely problem-free, aside from a minor fuel gauge issue that posed no immediate danger. In the cockpit were 3 pilots. The captain, Larry Davis, was a veteran with over 2 decades at Delta and tens of thousands of flight hours. Sitting beside him was First Officer Wilson Kirkland, an experienced pilot who knew the Boeing 727 inside and out. Completing the crew was flight engineer Stephen Judd, younger and newer to the airline but well-trained and fully qualified. The weather was perfect. Skies were clear, winds calm, and visibility unlimited. There was no sign that this flight would become one of the most haunting accidents in US aviation history. But hidden beneath the calm atmosphere was a chain of small mistakes, distractions, and missed warnings, each one quietly setting the stage for disaster. Shortly before 8 a.m., Delta Flight 1141 was pushed back from the gate. As the aircraft slowly reversed, the cockpit atmosphere was casual and relaxed. The captain casually mentioned that his paycheck had not yet arrived and asked the others about theirs. A simple conversation, but one that should never have happened at that moment. Once the engines were started, aviation rules required a sterile cockpit, meaning only flight-related talk was allowed. This rule exists to protect against distraction during critical phases like taxi and takeoff. Yet, from the very beginning, that discipline was quietly ignored. As the aircraft began taxiing toward the runway, the conversation drifted from paychecks to jokes and delays. Dallas Fort Worth was busy that morning, and the crew expected a long wait before takeoff. With no sense of urgency, the cockpit became more like a lounge than a command center. Instead of strictly following procedures, responsibilities blurred. Checklists designed to catch mistakes were started late and casually managed. Oddly, it wasn't the captain calling for them, but the other crew members. No one clearly took control, and no one clearly followed. During taxi, the captain decided to shut down one engine to save fuel, a common and approved practice. Still, it added another task that would later need attention. Meanwhile, a senior flight attendant entered the cockpit to ask about delays, another clear violation of sterile cockpit rules. What followed was nearly 10 minutes of unrelated conversation. They discussed food, travel, and even politics. The aircraft continued inching forward while critical setup steps faded into the background. At one point, the first officer jokingly remarked that if the plane ever crashed, at least the cockpit voice recorder would leave the media something interesting to hear. No one could have known how chilling those words would soon become. By the time the captain realized they had missed a radio frequency change, valuable focus had already been lost. The plane was moving, but the crew's attention was scattered, and the most dangerous phase of the flight was approaching. As Delta Flight 1141 continued its slow taxi, the runway still seemed far away. The crew believed they had plenty of time. That false sense of security would prove deadly. The flight engineer, more focused than the others, resumed parts of the taxi checklist. Instruments were checked, settings reviewed, and systems monitored. Still, the flow was broken. Tasks were interrupted, then resumed, then interrupted again. This was not how checklists were meant to be used. Outside the cockpit, birds could be seen near the runway. The crew casually mentioned them, but no one treated it as a serious hazard. Inside, the mood remained relaxed. By now, nearly 30 minutes had passed since leaving the gate. Then, without warning, the tower controller saw an opening in traffic and instructed Flight 1141 to move forward and line up for takeoff. Suddenly, the crew was rushed. This was a crucial moment. The captain could have requested a delay to properly complete the checklists. It would have been completely acceptable. Instead, he accepted the clearance. Now under pressure, the flight engineer and first officer hurried through the remaining items. Responses came quickly, too quickly. Some were spoken from habit rather than verified by sight. One key step involved setting and confirming the wing flaps for takeoff. The standard callout was made, flaps set to 15. But no one actually looked. The lever had never been moved. The flaps remained fully retracted. Recent changes to company procedures had made this mistake easier. There was no longer a specific moment when flaps had to be extended. Responsibility was unclear. In the confusion, the most critical configuration for takeoff was simply forgotten. The before takeoff briefing was also claimed as complete, though it never happened. Again, no one challenged it. With checklists rushed and assumptions unchecked, the aircraft rolled onto runway 18 left. Everything sounded normal. Everything looked normal. But the wings were still clean, configured for high-speed cruise, not for lifting a heavy jet off the ground. And the final safeguard, the one system meant to catch this exact mistake, was about to fail. As the Boeing 727 aligned itself with the center line of runway 18 left, the final clearance was given. The moment had arrived. When a jet is not properly configured for takeoff, the aircraft is designed to warn the crew. On the Boeing 727, this safeguard is known as the takeoff warning system. If flaps are not set, brakes are engaged, or other critical settings are wrong, a loud alarm should sound the instant takeoff power is applied. This time, it stayed silent. Captain Davis advanced the throttles. All three engines surged forward, pushing the aircraft down the runway. Inside the cockpit, nothing seemed out of place. No warning. No alerts. No reason to stop. The aircraft accelerated smoothly. Callouts were made as they always were. Power looked correct. Airspeed indicators came alive. Everything followed the familiar rhythm of thousands of previous takeoffs. But something subtle was wrong. As speed increased, the flight engineer noticed that the system responsible for limiting cabin air during takeoff had not armed. Normally, this happened automatically when takeoff thrust was applied. It was unusual but not alarming. The system was rarely needed, and there was no time to question it. The plane continued to gather speed. The runway lights blurred past faster and faster. At rotation speed, the captain gently pulled back on the control column. The nose lifted cleanly into the air. But the main wheels stayed on the ground. The aircraft refused to fly. Speed kept increasing. Finally, at a much higher than normal velocity, the jet staggered into the air. The tail slammed into the runway, throwing sparks behind it. Passengers felt violent jolts and heard terrifying bangs from beneath the cabin. Inside the cockpit, confusion turned to panic. Stick shakers activated, warning of an imminent aerodynamic stall. The wings began to wobble, struggling to generate lift they simply did not have. The crew had no idea why this was happening. The aircraft was airborne, but only barely, and it was running out of runway, altitude, and time. Now airborne by only a few feet, the Boeing 727 was fighting physics. With its flaps still retracted, the wings could not produce enough lift at low speed. The aircraft was dangerously close to stalling. The stick shakers rattled violently, warning the pilots that the wings were losing airflow. Instead of lowering the nose to regain speed, the captain instinctively pulled back harder, believing more lift was needed. The plane rolled slightly to the right as one wing briefly lost lift before the other. Sparks erupted again when the right wingtip scraped the runway. Passengers screamed as the aircraft lurched. Inside the cockpit, the crew searched for answers. The first officer noticed fluctuating engine readings and quickly reached a conclusion: engine failure. It seemed logical. Poor climb, loss of control, strange vibrations, everything pointed to a power problem. But the engines were not the issue. They were operating normally until airflow became disrupted by the extreme nose-up angle. Now, starved of smooth airflow, they began to surge and backfire, reinforcing the crew's false assumption. The real cause, the missing flaps, was never considered. Had the nose been lowered, the aircraft could have accelerated, gained lift, and possibly survived. But with the pilots focused on what they believed was a thrust problem, the nose remained high. The jet staggered forward at barely 20 feet above the ground, drifting beyond the runway's end. There was no space left to recover. Straight ahead stood the instrument landing system antennas, solid structures designed to guide incoming aircraft. The crew saw them too late. The first officer attempted to radio the tower, but there were no words left to say. Seconds later, the right engine struck the antenna structure. Fuel tanks ruptured. Fire exploded across the wing. After just 24 seconds of flight, Delta 1141 slammed back into the ground, breaking apart as flames engulfed the wreckage. Miraculously, everyone survived the initial impact. But the danger was far from over. The aircraft skidded and broke apart across the ground, coming to rest in a burning field of debris beyond the runway. Fire spread rapidly, fed by ruptured fuel tanks and torn metal. Against all odds, every person on board survived the crash itself. Passengers and crew crawled through smoke, heat, and twisted wreckage, desperate to escape. Many helped others despite their own injuries. But time was cruel. The intense post-crash fire claimed 14 lives, 12 passengers, and 2 flight attendants before rescue crews could fully control the flames. What had begun as a routine morning departure had turned into one of the most tragic accidents in Delta's history. Investigators arrived quickly. The flight data recorder revealed the truth almost immediately: the flaps were never extended. The cockpit voice recorder confirmed rushed checklists, casual conversations, and missed procedures. one question remained: why didn't the takeoff warning system sound? Tests revealed corrosion inside the throttle-related electrical contacts. The system worked only intermittently. On this flight, it failed at the worst possible moment. Further inspections across nearly 1,200 Boeing 727s uncovered dozens of similar defects. The warning system, meant to be a final safety net, could not be relied upon. Regulators ordered changes. Warning systems would now be triggered by actual engine power output rather than throttle position. Inspection intervals were tightened. Redundancy was improved. But the investigation made one thing clear: technology did not cause this crash alone. The true failure was human. Distraction. Poor communication. Assumptions. A cockpit culture where no one clearly led and no one clearly challenged. The accident wasn't caused by a single mistake, but by a chain of small ones, each harmless on its own, yet catastrophic together. And aviation would never look at cockpit discipline the same way again. In the aftermath of Delta Flight 1141, investigators focused heavily on human factors, the subtle behaviors that quietly erode safety long before an accident occurs. The sterile cockpit rule had existed for years, yet it was treated casually. Non-essential conversations continued during taxi, one of the most critical phases of flight. A flight attendant remained in the cockpit far longer than allowed. Checklists were interrupted, rushed, and completed from memory rather than confirmation. Even more troubling was the lack of clear authority. The captain did not fully command the cockpit, and the other crew members hesitated to challenge or redirect. Tasks overlapped, responsibilities blurred, and crucial steps were assumed complete without verification. This reflected a deeper issue at Delta at the time. Earlier FAA audits had already warned of weak cockpit discipline, poor communication, and inconsistent crew coordination. Flight 1141 proved those warnings were justified. As a result, the aviation industry began to change. Crew Resource Management, or CRM, was strengthened and standardized. Pilots were trained not only to fly, but to communicate clearly, delegate tasks, and speak up regardless of rank. Captains were taught to invite challenge, and first officers were taught that silence could be deadly. Checklist philosophy also evolved. Responses had to be based on visual confirmation, not habit. Saying the correct words was no longer enough. Airlines reinforced sterile cockpit rules with strict enforcement. Cabin crew were retrained to respect cockpit boundaries. Distractions were no longer tolerated. These changes transformed aviation safety. Accidents caused by miscommunication and distraction dropped sharply in the years that followed. Yet, the story of Flight 1141 serves as a reminder: even the most experienced crews are vulnerable when routine replaces discipline. The crash was not inevitable. It was preventable. Beyond training and discipline, Delta Flight 1141 also changed the way aircraft themselves were designed. Manufacturers recognized that humans are fallible, especially under pressure. Relying solely on memory-based checklists was no longer acceptable. Technology needed to actively support pilots, not just warn them. On newer aircraft, electronic checklist systems were introduced. These systems are linked directly to the aircraft's sensors. A checklist item cannot be marked complete unless the system confirms the correct configuration. If flaps are not set, the checklist simply will not proceed. Warning systems also became more robust. Instead of depending on a single electrical signal, Modern aircraft use multiple data sources to detect unsafe conditions. Redundancy became the standard. Flight deck design shifted toward clarity and simplicity. Critical information was made more visible. Alerts were prioritized so that the most dangerous conditions could never be overlooked or misunderstood. But progress did not mean perfection. In 2008, nearly 20 years after Flight 1141, a strikingly similar tragedy occurred in Madrid. Another aircraft attempted takeoff without proper flap configuration. Once again, warnings failed. Once again, lives were lost. The lesson was painful but clear: safety is not a one-time achievement. It must be constantly reinforced, updated, and defended. Every checklist, every briefing, every moment of focus exists because of accidents like Delta 1141. The passengers who boarded that flight expected an ordinary journey. Instead, their tragedy reshaped aviation procedures around the world. Their legacy lives on every time a pilot pauses to double-check a switch. Every time a cockpit goes silent during taxi. Every time discipline overrides routine. And every time a flight lands safely, unaware of the mistakes that never had the chance to happen. Delta Flight 1141 is often remembered for what went wrong in the cockpit, but its deeper meaning lies in what it taught the aviation world about complacency. The crew was experienced, qualified, and well-rested. There was no bad weather, no mechanical emergency at the start, and no external pressure forcing risky decisions. Yet confidence slowly replaced caution. Familiar routes felt routine. Checklists felt repetitive. Rules felt flexible. This is how danger enters quietly. A single distraction does not cause a crash. A single missed checklist item does not doom a flight. But when distractions pile up, when assumptions replace verification, and when no one stops the chain, the margin for error disappears. Flight 1141 demonstrated that accidents are rarely dramatic at the beginning. They start with casual conversations, with laughter, with the belief that we have time. The tragedy also highlighted the responsibility of leadership in the cockpit. A captain sets the tone. When discipline fades at the top, it fades everywhere. Silence from others becomes compliance, even when something feels wrong. Today, pilots study accidents like this not to assign blame, but to understand vulnerability. Training emphasizes humility, acknowledging that experience does not make one immune to error. Every takeoff is treated as unique. Every checklist is treated as vital. Every rule exists for a reason. Because behind each regulation is a story like Delta Flight 1141. A story written in seconds, but paid for over a lifetime. The story of Delta Airlines Flight 1141 ends not on the runway at Dallas, but in the lessons carried forward by modern aviation. Today, commercial flying is safer than ever, not because pilots make fewer mistakes, but because systems, training, and culture are designed to catch those mistakes early. Distraction is treated as a threat. Silence in the cockpit during critical phases is respected, not questioned. Checklists are followed with purpose, not habit. The accident taught the industry that safety is built layer by layer. When one layer fails, another must be ready. On Flight 1141, too many layers failed at once. 14 lives were lost after surviving the impact itself, a heartbreaking reminder that survivability depends not only on avoiding accidents, but on preventing fires, improving evacuations, and designing aircraft that protect life even in failure. For investigators, pilots, and engineers, Flight 1141 became a permanent case study. For passengers, it became a reminder of the unseen discipline required to make air travel safe. Every time you sit in an airplane and hear the quiet professionalism of the crew, you are witnessing the legacy of accidents like this one. Every safe takeoff honors those who were lost by ensuring the same chain of errors never happens again. Delta Flight 1141 was not doomed by fate. It was undone by distraction and remembered through change.